Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Bob Lee from 107.5 WBLS and the Make the Grade Foundation for Education. You're listening to Rudy Radio.
The views and opinions expressed during this program are entirely those of the show's hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of Rude Rangers Entertainment, its investors, management, advertisers, or staff.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Acupuncture is My Life. Now, in this episode, I'm going to discuss both the functions and the patterns of the small intestine. And the patterns are, as you should know by now, what causes this particular organ to not function properly and also play a part in disease or disorder. Now, understand, the small intestine has an interior-exterior relationship with the heart, whereas the heart is a yin organ and the small intestine is a yang organ. And this is a case pretty much for every internal organ. It has a paired organ, which would either be yang or yin. Now, the small intestine is a yang organ to the heart, which is a yin organ. So there are certain disorders that do affect the heart that also affects the small intestine. And we'll touch on that later. But for now, I need everyone, before discussing the functions of the small intestine, to momentarily attempt to block their understanding of the Western concept of the internal organs completely. Because again, to an acupuncturist, its functions as well as patterns of disorder or disease are somewhat similar but different, can be confusing. And this is when you're trying to compare it to, or attempting to compare it to, the Western concept of its functions and patterns. So allow for an acupuncturist to make that translation, and this is being done so that you can understand the benefits behind seeing an acupuncturist, why you should see an acupuncturist on a regular basis, and you can understand better your diagnosis and the intent of the practitioner based on the created treatment protocol that's designed uniquely for you, because everyone's constitution is different. No one is the same. And that's how you're seen in the eyes of an acupuncturist. No one is the same. And as an acupuncturist, our job is to reestablish the balance of yin and yang, whereas to a physician, that's considered homeostasis, because the body is strong enough to heal itself. It's designed to heal itself. All right? But just take a moment and attempt to block your basic understanding of the Western concept of the internal organs completely. Why? Because to an acupuncturist, the small intestine has two main functions, which are it controls receiving and transforming, as well as it separates fluids. Now you see, the small intestine receives both fluids and foods after it's been digested by the stomach and spleen. Again, I've stated in many of my past episodes that the stomach and spleen is responsible for all post-heaven chi or postnatal chi. All of the chi that's created by the body, that's created after birth, the stomach and spleen are responsible for. Now, after essence has been extracted, by the spleen with the support of the stomach, other internal organs get involved. So the small intestine receives both fluids and foods after it's been digested by the stomach and spleen. Whereas at that point, it begins its process of transformation further by separating the unclean, nourishing aspects of foods and fluids from the clean, nourishing aspects. Now, the clean, nourishing aspects of foods and fluids digested is then transported by the spleen as essence to nourish all of the tissues within your body. Now, this unclean parts of the food and fluids in which you've ingested are sent to the large intestine and the bladder, basically to be excreted from the body. Now, an acupuncturist also understands that the small intestine is responsible for separating fluids. You see, the role of the small intestine, or the role the small intestine plays on the movement as well as transformation of fluids, is of extreme importance. This function cannot happen without the support of kidney yang, because the yang aspect of the kidney is responsible for providing both chi and heat, which are necessary for the function of separation of clean and dirty fluids to take place. Now, if this is in any way confusing you, go back or go to the functions of the kidney on the Acupuncture is My Life YouTube channel and just review that. And it'll remind you of the basic powers of both kidney yin and kidney yang, and the importance of the kidneys in pre-heaven chi. This is the chi in which your body creates while you're in the womb. Once you come out of the womb, post-heaven chi is then created, and the spleen and stomach control this. So, again, if any of this is confusing to you, go to the Acupuncture is My Life YouTube channel and watch, not listen to, but watch the episode on the functions of the kidneys, as well as even the spleen and stomach. They're two separate videos, but just watching them would clear up a lot. Now, the clean part of the fluids is sent to the bladder for excretion as urine, and the dirty part of the fluids is sent to the large intestine, where some of the dirty fluids then get reabsorbed, and the rest is used to soften the stool for excretion. Now, when it comes to the small intestine, I want you to keep in the back of your head, the main function of the small intestine is that of receiving and transforming food by separating the clean from the dirty part, as well as it also has an important function in relation to the movement of fluids, because it separates the clean from the dirty And in order to carry out this function in relation to fluids, the small intestine communicates with the bladder, helping the bladder function of chi transformation. Again, if any of this confuses you, because I need you to remember this for when I'm discussing certain diseases, things begin to come together. If any of this is confusing you, again, go to the Acupuncture is My Life YouTube channel and watch the functions of the different internal organs. Now, the small intestine transforms food, but it can only do that when it's aligned with this process being formed or having been formed by the spleen. It transforms its fluids, so the fluids that enter the body in which you drink, in coordination with the bladder and kidney yang. Now, what can affect or cause problems with the small intestine, as understood by an acupuncturist? One can be diet, of course, and two can be as a result of emotional strain. Now, when it comes to diet, the small intestine is affected by the types of foods eaten based on its energy, which is key. Let's take, for instance, if you're eating too much in the way of cold and raw foods, then it creates cold in the small intestine. As with, if you were to eat too many or too much hot foods, it creates heat in the small intestine. And this affects its functions, creating patterns. And I will give you examples of that in a moment. Now, when it comes to emotional strain, right? The small intestine can be affected, let's say, by sadness. And it's basically when sadness, not just simple sadness, but sadness that affects you to the point where it destroys your mental clarity and capacity for sound judgment. Now, worry also affects the small intestine as well. And excessive worry tends to lead to chi stagnation of the small intestine. Now, you're going to begin to understand the connections between the small intestine and other organs relative to pattern, because the emotion in which worry is tied to is either the spleen and sometimes even the lungs. But because of the small intestine's relationship to the spleen when it comes to processing foods, essence to be distributed throughout the body, in this case, worry that can affect the spleen can also affect the small intestine and vice versa. Another organ is liver, because anger and frustration as well as resentment causes chi to stagnate in the small intestine. Now, anger, frustration is an emotion that's tied to the liver. So, if you were to ever go back to past episodes and the functions of the organs, or have watched functions of the organs on the Acupuncture is My Life YouTube channel, you would see that how much liver controls the chi that flows throughout the entire body, because one of its functions is to ensure the smooth flow of chi throughout the body. So liver chi can stagnate anywhere in the body, even in the small intestine. As a result, and relative to this example, as a result of anger, which is tied to the liver, frustration, resentment. Okay, so keep that in the back of your head, because when I begin to discuss patterns or disorders relative to the psyche in the future, I'll go deep into detail with regard to emotions and how emotions are tied to particular internal organs, and an excessive amount of that emotion can disrupt the flow of chi and blood within a particular organ, causing disease, certain types of disorders. Because to an acupuncturist, the human organism is one. It's one. And its theory of health is based around yin and yang. And to be in a healthy state, exist in a healthy state, yin and yang must be balanced. Whether it's from a mental perspective, emotional perspective, spiritual perspective, physiological perspective. And it's the responsibility of the acupuncturist, when disharmony between both yin and yang presents, to restore balance, so that the body is able to heal itself. Examples, let's say, of patterns of the small intestine. Full patterns. Normally I start with empty patterns, but I'll give you a few examples of full patterns. There can be full heat in the small intestine. You ever experience, let's say, insomnia, mental restlessness, mouth ulcers or tongue ulcers, pain in the throat, even slight deafness? Like you feel as if you're losing your hearing. Like, what's wrong with you? An uncomfortable feeling accompanied by heat in the chest area, abdominal pain, and then only a desire to drink cold liquids. And it'll also be like, let's say, dark urine, but not in large amounts. Just you urinate and you don't release as much urine. It's just a small amount. And there can even be burning pain when you urinate. And it's extreme when there's blood in the urine. This is a sign of full heat in the small intestine. You see, to an acupuncturist, just noticing abdominal pain, ulcers that are appearing on your tongue, and dark, scanty, and painful urination are enough for an acupuncturist to diagnose full heat in the small intestine. What can be the cause of that? Of course, your diet. Now, that can come from an excessive consumption of hot foods, like when you're eating a lot of meat, spices, or drinking too much alcohol. This can lead to full heat in the small intestine. And in some cases, when there's heat in the small intestine, there's stomach heat as well. And I speak on stomach heat when I discuss the functions and patterns of the stomach. which should be the last episode that was done. Now, what else can cause full heat in the small intestine to an acupuncturist is, again, we're going right back to emotions: anger, frustration, resentment, which is related to the liver; worry, that can be tied to either the spleen or the lungs, can also lead to heat in the small intestine. A treatment principle, the way an acupuncturist can treat that, is basically to drain this excess heat. The terminology used by an acupuncturist would be to drain small intestine fire. That's like when there's like a lot of heat, right? Now, a person can also experience small intestine chi pain. All right, where there's like, you'll feel a sensation of like this twisting pain in the lower abdomen. And in some cases, it'll extend to the back. That twisting pain in the lower abdomen, you'll also feel it in your lower back. There'll be some distension, some abdominal distension. And if you try and touch it, forget it. You can't. You wouldn't allow anyone to touch it, and you would naturally just shy away from touching it yourself. You'll feel very gassy. And for men, along with that twisting pain in the lower abdomen, this pain can radiate down to the testicles. And I've seen these types of cases at the Acupuncture's My Life clinic here in New York City. Now, what can cause that? Diet. Excessive consumption, again, of cold and raw foods. Because cold and raw foods interfere with the transformation function of the small intestines. Here we go again. It's about balance. Yin is cold, yang is hot. And when they're evenly balanced together, you have normal body temperature, 98.6, 98.7. And you're well regulated at that point. But now, if you're eating an excessive amount of yin energy foods, which are cold, it can affect the yang energies within the body, potentially suppress them, or create excess cold. Now, another cause of small intestine chi pain can be due to emotional strain. Again, these emotions being anger, frustration, and resentment, which tends to induce liver chi or cause liver chi to stagnate. And affect the small intestine. And liver chi stagnation, emotions are usually, for the most part, the cause of small intestine chi pain. Emotions. Yes, I know I said cold and raw foods as well, but emotions. And an acupuncturist in this case can move small intestine chi and promote the smooth flow of liver to clear up small intestine chi pain. Now, another full pattern of the small intestine is worms. And We get cases of this here at the Acupuncture is My Life clinic in New York City. Infestation of worms in the small intestine, where it'll present with, let's say, abdominal pain and distension, and there'll be this bad taste in the mouth accompanied by like this palish, sallow, low energy complexion. Now, if the person has roundworms, there'll be abdominal pain, and when they vomit, the worms would present in the vomit, and there'd also be cold limbs. Now, if the patient had hookworms, they'd have a desire to eat weird things like pencils or pennies, or, that's a sign you may have hookworms. You may want to eat dirt, tea leaves, and if it's pinworms, there'll be you'll feel an itchy sensation around the anus that'll really get bad at night. If you notice yourself scratching, especially a lot in that area, especially in the evening, that can be a sign of pinworms. See your acupuncturist right away. And they can also be tapeworms, where you're always hungry. And how does this happen? This is an external situation where you've basically eaten food that's not clean. In this case, most acupuncturists would not administer acupuncture as a treatment. They would treat or look to treat this problem with an herbal formula. And a lot of this you can learn about on the Acupuncture is My Life YouTube channel. Subscribe to that channel, and there's so much you can learn from it. And a lot of your questions can be answered as well. But those are full patterns. Like an example of an empty pattern can be small intestine deficiency of the small intestine with cold. A cold type of deficiency within the small intestine, where you'll feel like there's abdominal pain. It's kind of like, it's not sharp, it's sort of dull. And when you apply pressure to it, it's like, oh, I feel better. You'll want to drink tea a lot, hot cocoa, maybe even coffee. You'll have bouts of diarrhea. And you'll notice that your urination is pale. And you'll urinate a lot, and your limbs will be cold. The major cause, or the usual cause of this is usually dietary. And I'm sure at this point you figured it out. It's when you've eaten too much cold and raw foods. In a case such as this, I, as an acupuncturist, will look to expel cold, warm a person's intestines, and in some cases, and tonify spleen yang. In some cases, I would administer moxibustion therapy. So you see, when you enter an acupuncturist clinic, it's not like, oh, I'm going here to get needles. And there are a lot of individuals that'll come in, they have a phobia for needles. So any other way I can be treated, they'll ask. There's acupressure, moxibustion therapy, cupping, tuina, tai chi, qigong, guasa. There's so much. There's many ways in which you can be treated. But the thing that you must do is try and incorporate wellness visits in your I wouldn't say daily regimen, but just incorporate it in your life. You can see an acupuncturist once a week, every 2 weeks, once every 2 weeks, monthly, every 6 weeks. I don't know. It's based on your constitution and what's decided as best for you between you and your acupuncturist, along with your annual visits to your physician. But the key here is you must make acupuncture a part of your life. Because acupuncture is my life. What's yours?